Borders have been negotiated constructs since the first two people ended a dispute by drawing a line. Looking across that line or conquering so as to move it, people who theretofore may have been of the same or different ethnicities, nomadic or sedentary, agrarian or urban, practitioners of the same variant or highly divergent religions, have seen buildings that range from almost identical to spectacularly different from their own. Today, we look briefly at 5 examples. China's borders changed every century, yet no matter how far China extended at any time in any direction, her architecture extended further. This statement is driven by physical evidence. These are 4 buildings today within the territory of China, Korea, Japan, and Mongolia. Only one is or ever has been part of China, but only an architectural historian of East Asia is likely to know that one of the buildings is Taoist. Here I show 4 buildings in China, 1 Confucian, 1 Islamic, 1 funerary, and a set of buildings from a garden. The questions these buildings raise concern China and Chinese architecture as much as borders. Is it really possible that so much Chinese architecture looks like so much other Chinese architecture, and that it appears so similar or so similar to so much architecture in Korea, Japan, and Mongolia for 2,000 years? Or is this a superficial statement that one disproves by disassembling a building and identifying differences in individual components? I call this the field-defining question. Disassembling can indicate distinctions, but not enough to counter the fact that wooden frames and replicas of them, and ceramic tiles and replicas of them, and bracket sets and replicas in more media than just wood persist in China and far beyond China's borders through millennia. Why Chinese architecture changes so little is what I shall try to explain. Visual sameness is deeply rooted. It is much more than just the use of a building, foundation, pillars, bracket sets that interface with them, and a ceramic tile roof whose eaves turn upward. The notch timbers excavated at the Neolithic site Humudu, about 200 kilometers south of Shanghai, confirm the use of wood joinery in circa 5000 BCE. The same joining is illustrated in the 12th century architectural manual Ingzao Fa Shi, the building standards, and is still used today in repairs of the Forbidden City. Shall we call this sameness? An evolutionary biologist would say yes. Recent studies of homology and homoplasy assume evolution, and in the resolution find convergence. Aristotle understood sameness as object A and object B sharing all the same parts and being essentially related to their parts, even if in different ways. 2 examples of Chinese bracket sets are evidence of Aristotle's understanding of sameness when dealing with material constitution. Blocks and arms may be parallel to and perpendicular to the building plane, 600 years apart. The same blocks, the same arms are used in the same positions, even if their sizes and positions that is, the blocks and the arms, the blocks and the arms are used in the same position within the bracket set, even if their position in the building changes. The manipulative quality of post and lintel system yields flexibility and therefore adaptability. This feature sets Chinese architecture apart from other building traditions with features that repeat over long histories. Many are familiar with the classical Greek tradition that transposes to Rome or to provincial Rome or to neoclassical buildings and eventually to the Beaux-Arts. The Chinese use of past models is much more powerful, for it is not qualified by a word like Neolithic. The same frame and structure are used for imperial, funerary, Confucian, Buddhist, Taoist, Jewish, Islamic, and residential architecture. A palace becomes a Buddhist hall and vice versa by substituting a throne with an altar. This is because the Chinese building system is ranked. Eminent space is eminent space, no matter its purpose. The extraordinary aspect of this system is that the imperial throne room of the emperor uses the same timber pieces, ceramic tile roof, and wooden posts as a most humble temple. In the case of China's most eminent construction, evidence of wealth and grandeur is in the form of decorative material, such as gold, silver, lacquer, mother of pearl, or overlay to the timber frame. Still, this raises the question, why did China never abandon perishable materials for permanent ones? Chinese builders knew how to use brick and stone in the last millennium BCE. Underground tombs confirm this. The permanent system is used for all eternity. But above ground, without elaboration, the beauty of the system is that it can be drawn as simple as a stick figure, and therefore it can be exported far beyond China's borders. It was and can be accomplished as far beyond China's borders as Europe. It was and can be accomplished by anonymous craftsmen. The concept of architect, which assumes design, came to China only in the 20th century. It came after students went abroad to study architecture. Before the 20th century, the few names of builders or the equivalent of architects, designers who are known were Chinese officials. And the module can generate anything that those officials prescribe. Someone familiar with Chinese art might ask at this point if Chinese architecture follows a more general pattern in the arts. One observed, for instance, in painting, where Chinese court painters learned to paint by copying masterpieces of former times. Chinese painting, however, is profoundly different from architecture. First, it has a history that includes names of painters, and it has a history that strives for individuality. Two examples from the 17th century, but individuality comes earlier. More important, probably, Chinese architecture can often be private art. A painting can be rolled up, put away, and not seen for centuries. But a building requires financial support, whether of the realm or of the local community, and it is assumed that it will stand long after its patron is no longer here. Still, two works by human hands cannot be identical. Even with an earlier version or diagram in front of the painter or builder, a process that should be likened to translation is inevitable. Classical Chinese offers the words tian and offers the words tong and tong. The first, this one, suggesting an identity or one in the same, and the second, suggesting a kind of universality. But the concept of sameness, perhaps, is better expressed in the modern language by a word like yang, which means literally one style or one and the same style. It can be translated more eloquently this way to a term that means among myriad possibilities, only one right way. More literally, something which is written is under 1,000 tablets, but only one way. There exists orthodoxy in Chinese architecture. There exists an archetype which dominates even when the details differ. We have seen this in the bracket set. In 1923, Walter Benjamin challenged ideas of translation in his famous essay, The Task of the Translator, his preface to his translation of Les Fleurs du Mal. He said, but for Chinese architecture, perception weighs heavily on understanding. 18th century imperial builders assumed that their palaces and tombs followed those of earlier times, whether or not they did. This brings up the concept of mimesis, an even more difficult term to translate into Chinese. Perhaps we should use nitai, an intentional or deliberate resemblance. However one tries to explain it, the physical record of Chinese architecture is a multi-millennial history of buildings that are remarkably similar. So 5 quick examples. We begin with 2 representations of a Chinese timber frame building, both of them dated to the period 550 to 577. This one dated more precisely. This one, 602 kilometers southwest of the one on the left. The one on the left belonged to a xianbei, a non-Chinese lord living in the north. The one on the right to a Sogdian who came to China from the west. The structure is the focal point in each tomb representation. This one, a painting. It is painted right here. It stands among references to the Xianbei people. It is therefore a hub that confirms that this tomb exists within the world of China. Similarly here, the funerary couch of a Sogdian with representations of tents, the world of the Sogdian on it. But for all eternity, the center of that couch is a Chinese couple, the occupant and his wife, with the differentiation of Chinese architecture even to the different shapes of Chinese supports for the roof, and another sarcophagus of the Sogdians dated 579, a Chinese structure in every way that dominates the fact that the imagery is Sogdian religious sculpture. The person who put himself in this tomb is in a tomb that is entered by a Chinese building. It is in central Mongolia, right here in the southern part of Bulgan Conference. This painting is at the entry. The painting on the left is at the back, unambiguous Chinese space, inside of which one finds the dragon and tiger that represent China's eastern and western directions and are transported to Korea and are transported to Japan. The tomb, of course, is in Mongolia. In the tomb in Mongolia, we see Chinese officials, Chinese women at trees, Chinese figurines, Chinese guardian figures. All of them that I have just shown you from the tomb have counterparts in Central Asia, in another tomb in Mongolia, and among the people called the Sogdians. So some of those examples. My 4th example takes us to Japan. I fast forward to the 17th century, to the imperial mausolea of the first of the Tokugawa shogun. The use of architectural features follows that of the Chinese building tradition, follows the tradition of probably the Ming tombs built 200 years earlier in China. But in the details, we see Chinese officials, paragons of filial piety, Chinese lions, and Chinese dragons. My final example takes us back to Mongolia, Selenga, far north near the Russian border. The temple complex we look at is Tibetan, but the Tibetan aspect of it is concealed by Chinese architecture, a screen wall, towers, an entry gate, a pavilion that houses a stele, and the main hall in the main courtyard. One has to look to the far corner to see pagodas that reference Tibetan-style Buddhism. The pervasive appearance of Chinese architecture beyond China's borders may seem simplistic. I challenged it by myself before I began to do the research that led to this talk. I was surprised when I saw the pictures on the screen. I was shocked when I stood inside this tomb. This building complex is well published. I knew about it before I went there. One probably cannot give Chinese architecture credit for understanding the sameness principle or subtle differences between that principle and mimesis. Patrons of Chinese buildings in China and beyond China's borders probably did not process the borrowing or the implications of colonial construction. And yes, some of what I have shown you is colonial. China surely knew the power of historical memory, but it is a fact that in the 18th century, China notched perishable timbers and joined them into holes and grooves to make buildings in the manner of buildings of circa 5000 BCE. And it is a fact that this system was carried to Korea, Japan, Mongolia, Vietnam, which we did not look at today, and Europe. Logic may suggest that the rise and fall of dynasties and kingdoms across this vast space should have been numerous building systems. The physical record tells us that there was but one. I have called it China's, for its endurance plays a large role in why China itself has endured.